Welcome to this human-centered podcast called Value Through Vulnerability, which is dedicated to helping put the human back into humanity. And today, I'm actually very, very excited to be welcoming Dawna Jones, who is Chief Provocateur from Inside Out Consulting. Hello there, Dawna. How are you?
Hello, Gary. Thank you very much for having me on the program.
Not at all. I'm so excited. So look, as we get going, would you mind taking a couple of minutes just to give our listeners a little bit more background? Who are you? What do you do for work? And what are you passionate about? Dawna.
All right. Well, I'll start with what I'm passionate about. And I think that's the transformation of human consciousness at all levels, at personal, organizational, and global. And that's an important thread because it's the sort of one that when you're in a ditch, it helps you sort of look above the ditch and see what how do I get out of this and what is it that pulls me forward. I'm probably a fairly ordinary person in a whole lot of ways, and the journey started, professionally, I've been a professional facilitator working a variety of conditions and a variety of sectors, and that takes you into the more murky stuff, high-end conflict, nice complex issues, which are fascinating. But tied to that in my upbringing was just living in nature's systems. My father was a cinematographer, movie, wildlife, and that when you're with the in nature side, you seeing things through a complex lens is really easy. It's a very unifying view, and so we don't have the tendency to take everything apart. When you go into an organization, you can see, or human, you can see patterns, you can see the openings. Which I call insights, seeing things slightly differently. So yeah, it's kind of a lovely blend of where the personal path informs the professional and the value that brings when we're in the middle of very challenging change right now. Very an overall place where we really have to step up as human beings and be much more responsible and intentional about how we respond to what's around us.
Oh, that's lovely. What I'd like to do, before we get into more of your sort of day-to-day work, as it were, I'm always fascinated when I meet new people like yourself, Dawna, and you've done an English literature degree. So how does that get you into systems thinking and how all of these different layers of consciousness? Is there some parallel there from your education?
No, not really. Not really. No, I think that was a way of surviving university. I had the English lit, but I did the minimum I needed to do, and I trotted off to the boreal ecology classes and hung out and almost did my master's on reclaiming oil sites, actually, from the little animals, the little critters. So there was always a thread of staying connected to the ecological systems, and that stayed constant. I mean, my daughter, I was a single mom when my girl was a year and a half, and she's became a surfer. So we're out, and a photographer, and so I'm out there watching her surf, and as I'm watching her surf, you're asking, what are the things you're learning out there? So I've had some fascinating conversations with people about the subtleties in currents in oceans and how you detect those. So in other words, almost anything you do is a place to learn and a place to develop that higher, more attunement to what's around us. Doesn't matter what it is. So.
That really resonates with me, because I think you come back to a word you used previously in your introduction around intentionality or being intentional. I think we're so used to, aren't we? I certainly think the last couple of generations of sleepwalking almost through life and waking up. I certainly did this for 20 plus years, Dawna, waking up 20 years later and going, what's just happened? I've been like striving for like a car, a nice house, the job title. Like, what does it all mean? Hang on, it means nothing. So why was I doing that? And so it's this consciousness thing you're working in. Is it very much around that? Is actually trying to have people be awake as early as possible to make the most of that human experience, almost to some extent?
Very well said. That's exactly it. Because we do have some big, complex, murky, and messy issues, and we're watching the political institutions and the educational ones not cope very well with them. They're just not equipped. They're built on causality and linear thinking, and what we're seeing in the world today is all entangled. It's all interconnected. Very much so. And I've seen, cognitive arguments against that and presenting some sort of rational rebuttal to that, but that's not how nature was designed. It's not how life works. When you look at it through a wider lens, you can see these interactions quite beautifully. And I think that informs everything. It informs our lives, personal lives, that it informs organizational life. So I love that you hit that place and went, what? Because that's the place where you can pivot and dive deep and really be more true to yourself and more aligned with what you're all about and what you came for.
Actually, I'd really like to explore that a bit with you, actually, if I may, because
Yeah.
there's something, isn't there, this masks thing, this thing that people go into work, punch their card metaphorically at 9 a.m., leave their soul at home for 5 days, then go back home at 5 on a Friday and go, oh, it can be me again. You know, where do you feel systemically that's come from? How have we evolved to that sort of state, do you think, for so long?
Sorry, yeah, great question. I think that came about because at some point we bought into the belief that we're cogs in this massive wheel. And there's a resignation that goes with that. And I wouldn't even call it surrender, because surrender would suggest some sort of acceptance and some sort of capacity to embrace that. But no, it's just a belief that in order to get by in the world, in order to get the things you need in the world, you've got to sacrifice your soul and punch the clock and go in. That's, of course, that idea is dying, and it's dying in the disengagement statistics loud and clear. So this is the place where you can see people are still going through the motions because perhaps they don't know how to step out of that. And that is where, of course, the theme of this whole program comes back to the idea of there being, breathing deeply and saying, courage, let me step into something I'm completely not prepared for, not aware of don't know what's going to happen next. So I think it really means breaking open that belief that this is the way life is supposed to be, that you just, suck it up and hit the clock. Fortunately, I think younger people are not as numb to that idea. There's more openness there. Hallelujah. At the same time, there's also I've met some 18-year-olds who think like 81-year-olds or 91-year-olds, very traditional, stiff, rigid thinking. And we think, ooh, that's going to be tricky. So I think we're in a really exciting time from that point of view.
And thank you for using that word, exciting. We don't use anything of any sort of positivity in the sort of media, do we, at the moment? But I'm with you. I feel it isn't. I feel like I'm sorry to use this analogy, but when you have a cut on a scar on your hand, it's healing, almost like that scab part when your body's healing. I feel like we at societal level are scratching our skin going, oh, it doesn't feel right, it feels difficult, but we know it's going to heal after we've gone through that process. So I feel like we're almost at that scab. I know it's a bit of a gross example, Dawna, but that's my really sick metaphor for where we are. Does that resonate with you at all?
Well, I think what you're referring to is the opportunity to dive deep and see what's there. And we had this conversation, just chatting with somebody casually the other day, because you run across people who sort of say, well, I'm afraid to dive deep. I've run into that with my own work, because in order for us to really navigate these turbulent times with calm and with peace and with ease, you've got to dive deep. You can't just keep shuffling the pieces around on the surface of your life and hope that's going to do it. So, but people sometimes say, well, gee, if I dive deep, I might meet a part of me I don't like, or I don't know what's there. It's not predictable. It's not there. And it's like, yes, of course. That's exactly the point. You've got some aspect of yourself that you've been hiding from. Don't. Just go find out, get to know it. I think Mary O'Hara DeVroe, in a book called Navigating the Badlands back in 2004, sort of said, knock on the door, invite the skeletons out, give them a good hug, and find out who they are and what they're doing in there. So, and I think that's very much a part of this journey. It's just to kind of uncover these parts of you that can do so much more. There's so much potential that's, we're scratching the surface of the potential at this point.
And what sort of parallels are there for you between the sort of personal journeys that we're all on and call it the systemic journeys that we might say, because an organization at the end of the day is made up of people, but we still make it this ethereal thing that's got its own mind, body, soul, or whatever. Do you see that people should be able to live and breathe their personal purpose in the workplace?
Yeah, absolutely. There's no question in my mind. And I'm saying that knowing full well that I'm a terrible employee. I don't think I could ever be, fit into that context. So I admire people who can. I mean, my work is better done from the outside because I can hold a view of an objective view or a detached view of what's going on, and therefore see those undercurrents. So, from a personal point of view, when you start being able to observe the patterns in your life as you did in that beautiful pivot where you just went, I'm just doing this every day. When you start seeing how that shows up in workplaces, then you can also start to begin to see what's driving that underneath the surface. And that's where you get at the system. So the majority of organizations still work on what's we're seeing at the surface. Let's change people's behavior without actually appreciating that the behavior is being driven by a deeper set of beliefs inside the organizational mindset. And that's where you've got the real leverage in terms of shifting things.
So how do you go about, maybe just to share an example or two, how do you go about, if you're in let's say a more fear-based organization where leaders are, they're still run by ego, they're still a little bit afraid of being vulnerable. Well, how would you sort of try and get people to at least start on this journey, Dawna, in some way?
That's a super good question. And I mean, there's quite a few of us who work in the field who are sort of debating about whether it's even worth a try, because, in terms of the, in terms of the spectrum, you've got the inventors, the early adopters, the early majority, and then you've got the ones that are using the rotary phone, as Simon Sinek put it one time. So it's just like the ones that are using the rotary phone, you're probably going to need to just, that's a big jump. It doesn't mean, though, that the people in that kind of organization cannot make the jump themselves. I mean, if you reach a place where you feel you're under so much pressure to do something different, it doesn't mean you have to stay in that, oppressed, pressure cooker of a situation. You can get out of that. So I think that's where the call comes personally. And in fact, one of the things I've been writing about and talking about is using anxiety, seeing anxiety as somewhat differently than we typically see it. I mean, we see anxiety as the precursor to depression. So if you have anxiety, well then, that's coming, better get on the meds. But what if we saw anxiety as a calling, if you will, to an opportunity to do something that is more central and more true to who you are as a person. And I think, what you're referring to there, when people continue to operate as ego on their ego basis, it's a very suffocating place to be. And it's also not very free. There's not a lot of freedom in that being slave to the ego that's always seeking approval. I think in its highest form, ego is a highly trustworthy relationship with the self and with others. And I think that's where the evolution of ego can take place, and people can be inspired to kind of move from I need to control others in order to feel good about myself into feeling like I can actually express all of who I am and reclaim a sense of self within the context of my relationship with me and others.
It's really helpful, this, actually, because I love these conversations, Dawna, because in the moment I've got all these questions coming up. But so often, as you say, we're always training new behaviors. And I find it really interesting. I don't always stop myself to think, actually, what's that leader's beliefs about themselves that's stopping them stepping into this conversation or making them avoid having the conversation? Because as you say, it's not the behavior. It's what they're telling themselves in the moment about themselves, ultimately, isn't it? That's the barrier, I think.
Yeah, it's certainly one of them. I mean, we, in the course of doing podcasting for 10 years, I've interviewed some pretty interesting people. And one of them was telling the story about innovation in Ford. And they were sort of asked to go out and innovate. But in the end, the subtext was, as long as you didn't do anything different. And so when the different stuff came up, then whoa, it sort of went into a flash and of conflict. And it didn't need to be that, because the minute you witness that in an organization, you know that there's an undercurring belief system that's wreaking havoc. And so if you want to innovate, you actually have to stare at that belief system, and it's showing up in everyday decisions. But stare at the focus of that, and then say, is this really being helpful right now? And this is where you can really get some stronger, faster pivots done at the deeper levels, both personally and organizationally.
Would you mind maybe sharing an example of maybe where you've taken a pivot in your life, Dawna, in like, or maybe a more significant one? Because I can imagine you doing them all the time. But is there a significant point in your life where you really had to make a significant pivot, just out of interest?
Yeah, a couple. I think I'll give you one more on a overall trajectory scale, from a career point of view, but then also one from a what do you do when you're absolutely at the bottom of the pit and you need to bounce forward, as I call it. The first one was, I raised my daughter till probably about high school, just almost the end of high school. I reached a point where I thought, okay, I'm fried. I'm just burnt out. I've been running like a mad person. And I'm also extremely energy sensitive, didn't fully get the impact of that. And so I hit that point where I couldn't do it anymore. I just had to, and so my commitment to myself was, all right, I'm going to be more aligned. I'm going to lead at a higher level. And the reason for that, the purpose behind that is watching the ecological change, which, because I can see the underlying dynamics and deep dynamics in not just self, but organizations and in the world. When you see those deep dynamics, I realized that, gosh, we're not adapting fast enough as a species. We're not doing this quickly enough. So that was about 15 years ago, I'd say. And so I thought, okay, my job now is to shift up to that higher level and of leadership and commit myself to supporting the evolution of humanity to a more expanded consciousness so that we could actually work with everything all at once instead of, one thing at a time. So that was my commitment. And of course, pretty much right after, everything just tanked. I mean, everything. And I systematically lost everything over a period of time. So it tests your conviction, no question. And there's no, I'd be lying if I didn't say, there was fear and, moments of thinking about depression, and I've been there. So you sort of go, well, that didn't end well. So I don't think I'm going to resort to that. But at the same time, you have to you're aware of your state emotionally. And so my way around that was just to focus on what I was trying to do. And that's where I started podcasting. And I also found people who thought like I did, in terms of being able to see interrelationships and work with them organizationally and personally. And so I sought out a community, and that community has continued to grow globally. So I'm very grateful for that. So now I'll go to the one where you're in the pit, and because I lost everything, I included my home. I was on the road for 9 years, and the first part of of that period of time, first of all, it's a shock, because my belief system, the one I was raised on, says that when you work really hard, you will succeed. Well, working my butt off, for years, and I'd made it, I just, in terms, like, I had investments, I had, the coveted RRSP, retirement savings, whatever they call it in the country that you're in. And I had all that stuff, and yet there was still this emptiness inside, this sense of, so what? And so, well, that all disappeared, so I didn't have to worry about that anymore. And finally, I'm down to a place where I'm staying in somebody's cabin in a remote spot, which was fine. I don't mind. Solitude is a friend of mine. And I'm staying there, and I've got $5, and I'm looking at the $5, and I'm thinking, okay, I can either put gas in the car to go to do this volunteer professional thing I was in, or just to make me feel like I had some value, or I could take this $5 and buy a head of lettuce with it. What do I want to do? And it was one of those things where you're a little bit mad at the world, mad at the universe, and you feel like you're stuck in this spot and it's really not any fun. And so then I had just been finishing watching the movie or the documentary series with Ewan McGregor and Charlie Borman riding their motorcycles from the UK down to the southern tip of South Africa. I traveled through Africa twice, both as a teenager and then at a later point. And so I knew the situation that they were riding in, a small village in Africa. I forget what country it was in, but I'm thinking it was, I'm not really sure, but it would be toward further south. And they had, the word in the village had been that they'd heard ahead of time that these two guys were coming. And so they put little signs up on the road and invited them in for dinner. And both of them, they stopped their motorcycles, they drove in, it was completely off script, drove in, and these people in their mud huts had prepared them a meal of rice and whatever they had. And Ewan McGregor says, you know, at the time we knew that the meals we were eating meant somebody, at least one or two people, did not eat that week, that they were feeding us food that they didn't really have. And yet they did it with such generosity, such grace, such joy, and that the food tasted, whatever it was, it tasted even better because it was prepared with that spirit. And I'm reading a bit more into that because I know what happens when you eat food that's not prepared with that kind of appreciation and energy. And so I thought, well, this is the place where I just need to shift my perspective. I just need to switch how I'm seeing this situation that I'm in. And that's what I did. And then when you do it once, you got to keep doing it because otherwise it won't stick. You can easily fall back. But every time I was in one of those situations where I could get really annoyed at the situation or myself for getting myself into the situation, I used that perspective shifting way of getting out of it, of seeing it differently and being grateful for the experience, thinking that sooner or later it was going to be useful to somebody besides me. But yeah. And then of course the other day I'm on a Neuro Leadership Institute webinar and they happened to raise shifting perspective as part of resilience and transformation. So I thought, well, that's handy. Yes, I've been through that. So yeah, so that's really, those are two examples of memorable moments, if you will, in the process where you're aware that you need to do something different, and then you use what you've got to do it differently.
Yes. Thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate that. This my crazy journey that I'm still on at the moment, Dawna, certainly since last year when I had this, like I say, this energy awakening. The summit, the Have Courage Summit that I've been working on the last couple of months. It's been incredible to me, and it's not confirmation bias, but it's incredible how much I've seen the conversation pointing back to the energy that you give out is what you get back. If you give off a positive energy, you generally get it back. You know, and it sounds too woo-woo, but more and more, I genuinely believe we're talking now because of part of that energy. You know, I might be sounding a bit wacky, but please, sort of, for anyone that's listening to us, feel free to challenge or add in or reinforce whatever you're thinking right now.
Yeah, no, it's not wacky at all. It's actually, I think you're going to hear Greg Braid and then a number of these other, key educators in the field of energy speak about these concepts. So there's no question about it.
Yeah. So thank you for being part of that energy. That's very positive.
Yeah, well, likewise. Thank you.
So it was really interesting. I'd like to actually talk a little bit, again, with this podcast being about the very human-centered aspects of life. On one of your recent talks, something that's been really great actually was shared your talk on LinkedIn a few days ago. And one of the comments you made, which was really powerful for me, and I'd like you to expand on it if you will, is you said, emotions are our strongest ally in change. And would you mind expanding on that a little bit? So I think it's a really, really powerful statement. Yes,
of course. I think what's funny about emotions is that people, in fact, I just was reading an article on Medium about a woman who's been reported on how some of her male bosses had said, "Oh, you're too emotional," and then some political leaders in the world today are being criticized because they base their decision on emotions. But that's how we're wired. I mean, in evolutionary psychology, we were wired to pay attention to what our environment was and then to respond accordingly. That's where this sensory field we have is very much attuned to, am I safe? Or can I grow? What is the psychological, emotional, social safety in this environment that I'm in? And back in the day, in caveman day, it was around saber-toothed tigers and big things that might kill you or eat you. But now it's just plain out an overdose of fear, that people just, there's just this intense situation where we're always responding to fear. So the emotions then, if you understand if you know that you're feeling anxious, you can use that anxiety to be more aligned with your purpose. You can use that anxiety to make the decision you made just, a year and a bit ago, to do something different. And these are the openings where you can actually shift and become more proficient with using your emotions more as a compass instead of as something that we're trying to ignore. Because biologically, neurologically, we are wired to use emotions, and that's where the heart conversation, the vagus nerve conversation between heart and mind comes in. Because the whole point was, if I'm not safe, get out, fight, freeze, flee. But the other opportunity is to go with the flow, and that is to co-create. And so this is where, in terms of being aware of what's going on emotionally, you can avoid depression because you need to go out and reach out and connect with people. You can connect with, you need to connect with yourself and what matters and where values, what meaningful values you have. So your emotions then are really the pointers to where you can do things that allow you to be healthy and be at peace with what is absolutely challenging in terms of the kinds of innovation that we're seeing and the disruption to daily lives, although that's not as evident in a lot of situations unless you're a climate refugee, for example, in some of these countries that are now starting to go underwater. So this is, I think that's why I say that it's a compass. It's not something you demonize. If leaders were spending more time paying attention to the emotional, social health of the organization, they'd make a lot better decisions and they'd get timing right. Because a lot of times organizations don't manage to accomplish the change because there's too much fear. It's like, go forth and innovate, don't do anything wrong. And if you do something wrong, we'll punish you. That's just completely unsafe. So it's what, why would you do that? So it's very simple from that standpoint. It's just you use your emotions for growth, and the ones that are negative and challenging, use them also for growth.
That's just say, if so, I'm smiling at the other side of the screen, not people can see us doing that, because it's only been about the last 4 weeks, Dawna, seriously, I've been saying to myself and other people, our emotions are just a data point. There's nothing else. There's nothing associated. There's no meaning. It's just a data point in the moment. And you've just sort of, you brought that to life for me. So thank you. It's really,
No, that's exactly it. And that's exactly what I was trying to say in that video that you kindly shared on LinkedIn when I was speaking with Agile People Sweden. It was very much around, this data is there, use it. And when you've got it, when you can learn how to read it, and then we've got as many men who are emotionally and energetically sensitive as we do women. What we're learning to do is to read those environments more accurately, and then you can make way better decisions.
Would you say then, going forward, we're in this, don't like to use terms too much, the VUCA world, it is just fast paced, it's busy, everyone's 100 miles an hour. It seems to me from our conversation today that emotions are actually the safety net to navigate this volatility and this complex adaptive system that we live in. If we're not actually talking to them and listening to them and dealing with them, then people are just going to get lost in the void, it seems to me.
Yep, exactly. And that's why they get anxious and where they get depressed and why we've got high suicide rates, particularly amongst men in the world. But, equally, there's high suicide rates or high depression rates, at least amongst both genders. So these are the places where if you're paying attention to those emotions, you can actually reclaim a lot of control in your life by knowing how to work with them instead of just sort of trying to ignore them, which means you're going to get hijacked sooner or later. And you see that in the early days when I started working in this area. You turn on, there'd be a YouTube video of some guy having an absolute meltdown in an airport. He just, gone overboard with stress and he lost it. That's an example of someone who it kind of set their emotions off in a different department, because if he had actually paid attention to how much anxiety and how much stress he was under, he definitely would not have taken himself out with a serious major meltdown. So it is not just a navigational tool, it's a tool for well-being and much better decision making. And that's been established in the research, so I'm not saying anything that's shocking or anything. It's there. It's just it's not paid. Nobody pays attention to it. It seems particularly in some workplaces.
I'm finding this quite a fascinating sort of paradigm at the moment. The example you give on emotion is a similar thing with diverse boards at the moment. People are talking about. Apparently, there's so much evidence for breaking groupthink, breaking silos, getting more diversity of thinking. Yet something else is holding that back happening. The evidence is there. It's so much better performance of boards if they're more diverse, yet we don't seem to be seeing that happening. Is it just all fear? It's just all fear that's stopping some of these progress?
Well, I think it's two things. I think there's fear of, moving out of the comfort zone and trying on something else, but there's also a set of skills that go with that. Mm-hmm. And my premise is that certainly the skills I learned being homeless for that period of time and moving from being absolutely terrified most of the time to being more at peace with what showed up. I think it's key to that. So the same skills that you use for navigating complexity are the ones you would also use when you're entering into more diverse team conditions where you're not sure who everyone is. And maybe there's a whole series of biases on top of that. That's where the gender bias and the 150 some odd cognitive biases that can make a mess out of things, pretty much all of which people are, even when they're aware of, can't control per se. So you have to design for that. But I think that so it's a set of skills. It's more advanced. It means being more aware of what you're thinking. And a lot of people believe absolutely everything they think, and that's a bit dangerous because where's there room for new perspectives, a different way of seeing it, for opening up the box and exploring more deeply. I think that's really where the skill sets come in, and to really start being able to advance the consciousness skills that go with new territory.
If you're going to pick sort of what from your work, what do you see as maybe the sort of the top one or two for anyone that's listening to us? I appreciate everything's a spectrum, but are there one or two key skills that you think are absolutely fundamental to sort of navigate this world, this more human world, this complex world that we're all in now, but may continue to continue at a pace? So there's sort of one or two that you think are absolutely fundamental.
Sure. And the first one is shifting perspective, just the one we already talked about earlier. So that one is one of those things where if I take myself out of this spot, and the one I often used to use is I'm flying overhead like an eagle would, and I see myself in context. What do I see? And from that point of view, from that perspective, where do I want to steer myself next? So more often than not, when things go sideways, people think they're helpless, and there's a sense of victimization. And that opportunity is, when you're in that place, to use it to co-create, not survive. That's not good enough. We've been consuming the planet on the basis of surviving, but to use the conditions that we're in personally and organizationally and globally to co-create something better out of it, to work with those conditions. So the second thing then is to accept what it is that's showing up. There's some people have had car accidents, or they've had certain things that have hit them hard, and then they become victims right away, instead of realizing that, no, that was probably an interruption that was needed. There was some sort of opportunity to shift, to do things differently. What is it? Reflection on that. What might you do now differently than you wouldn't have done before? So that's the second one. The second one, and the third one is to use conflict to advantage. Because I find that both adverse conditions and conflict have something similar. It's things are not happening the way we expected them to. There's uncertainty. I can't predict it. I can't control it. Perfect. This is where you don't try to predict it. You don't try to control it, but you actually step into it to understand what's going on. So there's an empathic an opportunity here to expand empathy, but also to discover what is this tension about, and how can we use that tension more constructively? Because what people typically do, both personally and in organizations, is they thrive on the drama and don't actually learn from the conflict. So, you know, as you mentioned earlier, you go on board with a diverse team. Every single person on that team is going to be able to contribute something different. What might that be? So it's curiosity over condemnation or judgment or the easy ones, the easy outs, but to really breathe deeply and say, I'm going to ask you, you know, I'm going to go over to the kid that's tattooed from top to bottom and say, you know, who are you? And, you know, why are you, what's important to you?
Oh, this is this is really beautiful. This is honestly, you get me thinking lots. I could keep you all day. The thing that's coming up for me actually, which is really interesting, despite us talking about how do you navigate a complex world, is, and I've seen this time and time again, it's actually getting present and actually stopping and not feeling guilty for that, to have these conversations that actually helps us deal with the adaptive nature of life. And I just find that quite an interesting paradox.
Yep. No, you've nailed it. That's exactly it. Yeah. Because, you know, a lot of people live in the future as if it were today, but no, we're creating that with every decision. We're creating that with every moment that presents itself. So to worry about the future, what's the point of that? So it's not to say don't look at the future. You know, have some sense of direction, have vision for it. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying don't project your fears into the future so that you can be more afraid than you already are. I mean, how does that make sense? So it's exactly that, to be present and just sort of notice, you know, what's going on for me. How do I feel about this? And do I let myself freeze, or do I work with the flow in the moment and just work with it and see what shows up, both in me and in the circumstances.
I love it. So for anyone listening, getting present, curiosity, listening, you know, these are really like the fundamental building blocks of what we are and how we're going to navigate going forward, which I think such a yeah, I'm excited by that, really.
Yep. And as we should be, because this is where the discoveries take place. You know, I think really what we are now is exploring new frontiers, new territories of human potential, particularly as it's being shaped by the conditions of the world today, which we actually created through a different level of consciousness. So now what we're attempting to do is to expand our consciousness so we can create something that's beneficial for ourselves and beneficial for nature and the world we live on, the planet, the oasis in the galaxy, as somebody said the other day. I thought, oh, that's beautiful. But, you know, that's what we're here to do, I think. And we can use it, you know, we do it personally through whatever initiatives we have. We can do it in business by, you know, business participating in the regeneration of these natural systems that have been used for economic purposes, by business just being socially responsible being the major word, and by looking at these complex issues in a very different way, in the globally one. So yeah, lots of excitement ahead, and fun too, and challenge.
But like you said, that's where the growth edge comes in. The challenge is where the growth comes from. So no, that's so exciting. I'm conscious of time. I really could keep you all day. And maybe there'll be a part 2, Dawna, if I can get you at some point. There we are. Just putting it out there, just so everyone knows I can get you again. So
I'd love to do that. That'd be fun.
Awesome. As we start to wrap up, just a bit of a random question, but I like to ask all my guests: who or what is inspiring you the most right now?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it's people that are being true to themselves, people like yourself who are sort of recognizing that running the routine and the hypnotic state is that's not fun anymore. I love it when people like, for example, I did a podcast with these young entrepreneurs out of Afghanistan who are rebuilding the economy in Kabul using social entrepreneurship. That kind of courage is mind-blowing for me. So I love following people that are intentionally pushing that edge and intentionally seeing, you know, what if we do it differently? And yes, you know, like I'm looking at Kashmir, remote areas in Africa where there's opportunity to do things so much different. I think it's the citizen-led action around the world that just I find super exciting and inspiring.
That's amazing. I just want to reinforce for anyone that's listening. Do you just want to share the name of your podcasts again?
The current podcast is the Inspirational Insights from Insight to Action. So that's version 2. And I'm just thinking about maybe winding that one down, or maybe just, I'm not doing it as regular as it was, is what I'm saying. And I'm looking to do one now on global change, citizen-led global change. So.
Oh, amazing. The reason I wanted Dawna to share that is because one of your previous episodes was brilliant, actually spoke about some of the developments in the Middle East and Africa. And I was just blown away by, just the way you can even talk about change, social change in Kashmir. So many of us, including me, my consciousness doesn't reach that far. So to have people like you having those conversations and bringing it to at least 200 people on this podcast, I think is so, so powerful, because we are all connected. I genuinely feel that. But if we're not having these conversations, we can feel quite isolated.
Yeah, agreed. And I think that's the opportunity, is to be, is to reach out, even if it's vicariously, to understand what are people experiencing, what's going on, because the kind of issues we're seeing on immigration or not, I mean, it's crazy. We live on one planet. And so if we can't figure out how to do that well, then I'm not, I have big question marks around civilization. So I think this is where we have lots of inspiration and lots of places to go to walk into someone else's shoes and see the world through their eyes, and to learn from them, and to really restore hope.
Love that. Well, what a lovely way to finish. Would you mind letting the listeners know if they want to reach out to you, or contact you for work or any other purposes? What's the best way to find you?
Best way to find me is on From Insight to Action. I know the website is being redesigned, so I don't know what shape it'll be in by the time you get there, but it's FromInsightToAction.com. I'll be doing a 2-day workshop for SEGECA in Belgium on the messy middle of organizational transformation at the end of April. And of course, I do the speaking and workshops and skill development that you would expect from based on the conversation we just had. So so that's how to best reach me. And of course, I'm on Twitter and LinkedIn. And so it's Dawna Jones, by the way, so not spelt the ordinary way. Yeah, thank you very much, Gary. Love it.
Not at all. Well, no, I've really appreciated your time for today. It's been an absolutely fantastic conversation. I'll make sure those details are in the show notes.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Have a great day. Cheers. Bye.
Bye.